our side. And fourthly, we are telling you that we can just buy this land from the rich as a state on our side as well. If we recognize, okay, we need a hospital there, we just take out a pile of cash, give it to them, and then build a new hospital. So there's no problem really. No, onto the property rights. Firstly, we are telling you that actually those awful companies who they want to push away from these countries and take their land away are the ones who are employing these people and giving them money and actually maybe giving them opportunity to rise from their economic bad situation. Secondly, we are telling you that all the benefits of this argument, meaning the motivation, etc., were never even tackled by the side of proposition. Now on to the governmental redistribution of the land. Firstly, governments are corrupt. They themselves gave you the example of Brazil, who actually gave its own state land to the companies to destroy rainforests. And this is exactly what we are telling you here, is that these states decide for themselves to go and to give this land away. So we do not see a clear incentive as to why would that change on your side, because we are telling you that social services and the poor are not those who win elections. For the governments, it is lobby and it is manipulation through the media of the poor and of the uneducated. So this would not happen, what they're telling you here. And also on the point of market of land, firstly, what we are telling you, if we do have like a decrease in prices of land that they claim we would have on our side, what we are telling you is that what would simply happen is that the rich people who actually have certain savings on the side would be able to buy much more land, whereas the poor people who do not have any savings would not be able to afford themselves to buy their residence back again, which in the end would be much more detrimental to these people. Before I go on with my substantive, yes please.
So your argument is that governments are besieged by private interests. So instead, the land should be controlled directly by these private interests instead.
No, what we are telling you that at least on our side we have people who are poor and who at least have some land to take and to actually control how is it going to be, I don't know, redistributed, or could they live it if they want to live in it, or they want to rent it, or have a stable income from it. What happens on their side is that all the land from these poor people is being taken away and possibly given to these companies, so we see a huge harm in that shape. So how are we disproportionately harming lower classes on their side? Firstly, how does their life look like? We are pretty sure, and I think we both agree that they are born in poverty, they have much lower chances of generally having a prosperous life and having a good quality of life. So why should we protect them? Firstly, because it is the duty of a state to protect its citizens when they are struggling and to protect their rights. And secondly, because low and middle class are in need here, and the rich people take care of themselves anyway, so we do not believe that they should be really protected here. So what happens on the proposition? So in a certain moment, people lose their homes because there is an expiration date. The side of proposition, if they want to claim to just let all of these apartments and homes and houses and whatever stay in the hands of the poor, they're not affirming the motion, which means that they cannot win this debate. So no matter whether they're rich or poor, they lose all land they have, and in that moment, people have to find residence. So what happens with the upper middle class is that they have savings that they can use to buy themselves real estate again. For example, 10 to 22% of American population have $170,000 or more saved. What this means is that they can afford to ensure themselves housing and maybe even buy some more land, because obviously the prices are falling. At the same time, the poor don't have a pile of cash in their bank accounts in which they can rely to buy a place to live again, because they're not storing their money in anything but land. They do not have shares, they do not have bonds, they only have land. They will probably in that case go and buy a property whose expiration date is sooner because its cost will be much lower. No, they still probably won't be able to afford even that, but will have to turn to either rent or get loans. Why? Because lowest 20% of households own less than $1,000 in saving in the USA. And this practice is unsustainable, bearing in mind that rebuying real estate would have to happen every few years or even less. Now, how do we protect them? They keep their land, they may be inherited, or they have it acquired. So what is the impact of all of this? Is that we protect their quality of the life. Why? Because they have a place to live. They do not have to take on huge loans to buy a home, or worry every few years about where are they going to live, or save that the little money they have for buying a home instead of investing in better life and future for them, either through taking care of their health, paying for their kids' college, eating healthy, etc. So in the end of the day, they either push companies away and they have huge unemployment on their side, or the corrupted governments do even situation that is currently in the status quo. For all of these reasons, please oppose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll have the third speaker for proposition.
The case of the opposition is this. Land is very important. It's important because people need a sense of security, etc. We agree. The problem that proposition has is that the poor don't in fact own the land. And what we attempt to solve on our side is using this policy, we're able to redistribute it such that the very people that they're going to be able to talk about actually get the land in the first place. Before I move on with any substantive questions, I want to make one thing clear. Second opposition talks to us about a case shift. It's not a case shift. You can do two different things with the land at the same time. Kenneth talked to you about one aspect, but he was clear that there were other things that we could do as well. Barth extended on the other aspect. It's not a case shift. With that, three questions. First, who owns land? Second, how do we develop land? Lastly, what is the comparative that side opposition is forced into? So first, who owns land? We submit to you that the main people who own land around the world are the rich, who earn it, frankly, by being born and being able to inherit it. And recognize that the core of the opposition argument to the right of property is that the land is intrinsic because you earned it. But we suggest to you that there's very little moral obligation that states have to do things like protect stolen money, for example. If you did in fact steal that money, you have an obligation to return it regardless of how important it is to you. Moreover, we give you substantive logic why states violate this right all the time. They accepted progressive taxation on their side of the house. They give no reasons here. The main response that they had to all of this analysis is just to deny the fact that the rich own the land. Here are a couple of reasons why they do in fact own the land. The first is, in many developing countries, during the process of decolonization, one of the main groups of people that colonial governments sold this land to are those who are incredibly close to the government in the first place. This was like in groups, for example, like the Tutsis in the first place. Second of all, in massive processes of decolonization, terms like oligarchies example, fire sales also mean that individuals who are close to the government buy this land in the first place. So what does all of this mean? This means that the vast majority of individuals who own land in the status quo will be the rich. And that means that all of the benefits that they hang their entire case on, the idea that the poor need this land in order to survive, don't accrue on their side because the poor don't own land. And the worst part is, when that land is held in perpetuity, they never get that land at all on their side of the house. So that's about the vast majority of their case taken down. So let's move on then to the second question then. Why do we need land? We say on side proposition that the reason why individuals need land is because there's a scarcity of land that exists and because governments need crucial services. Their argument here is inequality isn't caused by land ownership. First of all, this was contradicted by what they said when they said $7.2 billion is caused by land ownership. Moreover, and I think this is important here, lots of industry happens on, guess what? Land. What does this mean? If you need to build a factory, which they talk about, you're going to need to own the land that the factory is on. If you want to provide jobs, for example, you're going to have to be on the land that the factory is on. All of this suggests that land is very, very crucial for industry. And this is especially so in the many parts of the developing world, which are heavily based on things like agriculture, primary, secondary industries, like for example, industry. All of this suggests that land is crucial to this. So why then is government taking back this land, or at least being able to decide this land, important for redistributing inequality? There are a couple of reasons here. The first is, this land can be used for public services. So in the past, when the land is held in perpetuity, governments are no longer able to sensitively respond to things like demographic shifts. A good example of this is, in many parts of cities like Hong Kong, for example, when the poor need housing, the government has to wait for these individuals to be willing to sell the land before they can. They cannot coordinate and they cannot respond to population shifts and important issues on our side of the house. They say that, but the government can just walk up and ask the land to be bought. The problem is that they give so many good reasons as to why individuals probably wouldn't want to sell their land on their side of the house. Furthermore, if they want to use eminent domain laws, which means that governments come and take away that land, that's by right a contradiction. Because their argument on property rights, business stability, all fall at the exact moment in which governments can come in at any point in time and say, hi, I need a railway station, that land is mine. What's the comparative then? The comparative is on proposition. where at least you're able to figure out it's predictable. For example, you as a business owner know that in 50 to 90 years, that land is probably might be released from the government. What does this mean? This means that you're more likely to be able to predict, and it makes a more stable business environment because you're able to make executive business decisions in the long run. The other claim that they say here is that, but the government is bad. I have a couple of responses here. The first response is we need to admit that governments aren't perfect. That's probably true. But recognize what exactly the comparative is. On the vote of the proposition, the poor and the rich each have one vote. In the vote of the opposition, the land is controlled by individuals who have all the money and the poor comparatively don't. What does this mean? This means luxury apartments are probably going to be built because the rich now vote with their dollars rather than anything else. This means, for example, that the rich who now have a monopoly on land are able to exploit the poor. So they say that the companies need this land for industry. Well, yes, that's a truism, but the question is how they're going to carry out this industry. And we suggest when there are very little consequences, for example, to doing things like strip mining, when there are very little consequences to doing things like not developing this land properly, that's when the rich are more likely to build unsustainable industry at that point. What does this mean? This means that in the world of the opposition, you get significantly less equality between individuals. This means that the industry that is built is significantly less sustainable. In the world of the proposition, there are crucial checks and balances. Governments can sensitively respond to population shifts, build hospitals and homes that individuals need, not wait on the benevolence of individuals and governments on our side of the house. So, with all of that said, let's move on to the final question on the comparative. So, they say, and we like to be very clear here, governments in the world of proposition aren't perfect, but they still do need land. There is still some level of populist pressure to be able to, for example, give welfare to your people, regardless of where they come from. So what exactly does this mean? This means they're going to have to take the land from somewhere. And these are the groups that they're going to take the land from. First, they're going to take land from indigenous peoples who don't have title deeds to their land. Second, they're still going to take the land from the poor. The reason is because often land from the poor, in the vast majority of cases, when they can't take land from anywhere else, I'll take you in a second, is the one that doesn't have legal justification or backing behind it. They don't have a title deed behind it. The last thing is things like rainforests, for example, things that are incredibly dangerous because they can't redevelop city land, for example, for more sustainable purposes. What they need instead is to go to rainforests and expand the city itself. Before that, yes?
Taking away land from indigenous communities is exactly what is going to happen on your side, because then finally they have the power and the mechanism of doing so, and they have nobody to justify themselves to.
Ma'am, we explained to you why they're less likely to want to take land from the poor when they're able to have more land at their disposal in order to, for example, release certain land for redirecting purposes. That's unable to happen when, on your side of the house, the government is now forced to actually take land from individuals because land is by right held in perpetuity. That means that the comparative on your side is all of the harms that the poor are likely to feel become so much more amplified in that regard. So now, what exactly then is the case of the proposition? The case of the proposition is very simple. In the vast majority of cases, individuals who currently own land are not the poor. They don't get the benefits of land. 2, in many instances, inequality is driven by land ownership and the rich. 3, when governments are able to lease the land, there are systems of accountability to ensure that we're able to redistribute land, help individuals on the ground using government services. That means that we're able to prevent inequality from happening. Lastly, when governments are desperate because they can't take old leased land, they end up going for far worse alternatives, harming the poor on their side of the house. We believe that perpetual land ownership perpetuates poverty. We propose.
I'd like to invite the third speaker for the up to continue the debate. For the other side, you're here.
government takes land from indigenous people. It takes land from rainforests. It takes away land from poor people who don't have power to fight for themselves. This is all statements that came from side proposition, what happens apparently on our side of the house. Well, the main question is, what do you then assume when you give the government like an actual policy that says you can take away land and do with it as you please? What we believe is that the government will use it in the only way government has from the dawn of time been shown to use it in the interest of those who actually have the power behind them, those who have the money in the modern world. So I will show you why we win this debate through three main clashes. Firstly is about how the government actually will act and about corruption. Secondly is about property rights and the poor. And the third one is about speculation. So firstly about government corruption. So when basically they can come to with things such as rainforests, indigenous people, things like that, with example of Brazil. What we are telling you here is, and then giving it obviously that land to some corporate interests to actually make plantations and things like that. What we see from this, from their own argumentation, is very simple. That governments do things that will help individuals with money. People who can afford lobbyists, people who can actually afford to finance these campaigns. Saying that most countries today are not corrupt is simply not acknowledging the reality of the status quo. It is the fact that almost every country has corruption. I'm just going to say it. Every country has a degree of corruption. Some less, some more. But in every case, what will happen is that those who will be taken away, who will be the most protected, are those with the most amount of money. Those who can go and leverage that money to try and change the way government works. So what we are telling you is that because they have so much power, the poor are the ones that will, on their side, actually be taken away from it. They won't give it to the poor. Why? Because it's all the interest. There's no interest. Poor is that you can maybe get one vote. From a rich person, you can get a ton of money that can actually help you win more election. Secondly, they tell you about selling things for profit, selling land for profit. Who will they take this land for profit from? They'll take it from the poor because they're disenfranchised. They tell you this themselves. And then who will they sell it to, obviously? Well, they'll sell it to the rich. Why? Because the rich are the ones with the money, not the poor. This is everything that comes from their own case, and this is why we believe this is simply not correct. What we're telling you, and this entire time, is that we should have things such as taxes, something that doesn't take away property in and of itself, but takes a cut from it. It's fundamentally different. It's less intrusive. Why? Because by design, progressive taxes, they hurt the rich more than they do poor. The government can't actually do anything about that without, basically making a different law that taxes the poor more than the rich. Yeah, sure.
Which one is more likely to care for the poor? A profit-motivated company who hires the poor at minimum wage, or a government whose public oversight and very onus is on protecting
What we're telling you is that we have two different things here. We have private interests in control of the land, or something that we believe is much more dangerous, and that is government who can control all the land, but with private interests backing them. This means that private interests will still be in control, let's be realistic, but now they will have the power of the government to get what they want. We believe this is extremely harmful because it will only serve to further harm the poor. And any benefits that they tell you of social services and things like that, they will build hospitals, they will do things like this. If there is, what we think, it's much less likely that this will happen than what I've told you. Why? First of all, things like public services are a relatively small amount of land. When you build a hospital, that's one plot of land. It's not that much. But for giving people, a ton of land for plantations because they gave you a little money for a tennis match or things like that, that we believe is far more likely. When they tell you about injustices of the colonial system, we believe that they just don't understand the world hasn't changed all that much behind the scenes. It just looks a little bit prettier. The rich will always profit and the poor will always end up with the short end of the stick. This is why we believe we need property rights. And I will explain that more in our second class. No, thank you. Second question about the property rights in the global poor. The reason we have told you about property rights and why they're so important is because property rights are the best safety net. It is the one area that distinguishes what you have from what the state has. It gives you independence from the state. That is crucially important. This is the reason why in Western society property rights are considered sacrosanct, because that is the only way you can ensure individual rights against the tyranny of the state. When we have property rights, what do we actually feel? What are the concrete benefits? We have safety, or at least the belief in safety. That means that we can actually do things that we might not have done were we not to have this guaranteed thing that will always be a fallback net. We can take risks. We can go for more education. We can start maybe some small business like a shop or something like that. We can maybe expand our farm, maybe buy some other plot of land, maybe improve ourselves much more. Is this sort of growth for the poor slow? Yes, it is very slow, and we understand that. But what we believe is at least it happens and we don't take things away from them. No, thank you. Because these are things that are actually independent of social services. It's something that the poor can do for themselves, and we believe that this is something that is crucial in our society. When I tell you about poor people not having any land, that they have, what we are telling you is that the ones that do have land rely on it with everything. To them that is everything. And the ones that don't, well, at some point during in their lives, or maybe in the lives of their children, they will acquire land, and then to them it will be of crucial importance. We have to protect that. We have to protect the one thing that the poor can rely on that isn't the government controlled by private interests. Because what the government, what the company can do with the power of the state behind it is much more. They can just simply remove these people from properties. They cannot do that if they can, only do things with money. And when they mention things such as corruption within the industry, making, unsustainable things that are not good for the public health, they don't change that. These are terms for 50, 90 years. How is this? How can they control it? And secondly, most natural resources are already considered public domain and are only given in concession. So this point doesn't really stand. They shouldn't have brought it in their third speech. No, thank you. And now, because I've proven to you that the property rights, especially for the poor, are of vital interest to protect them from the big business trying to remove them from their country, from their estates, and the government obviously being corrupt, we believe that we win the second clash. And on to the third clash, which is about speculation. Well, first, what we'd like to tell you about this is that it has not really been proven as such a huge impact within this motion. Even side of proposition has delayed very little time to it. But what I will say is that, first of all, they've never proven why it is necessarily so harmful that this land is being speculated. They tell you that, well, this land isn't being used, which is contradictory with the fact that we don't have enough land and we need to take it if there is so much land that isn't actually being used. The government could obviously simply buy this land and prevent speculation if they so wanted to. Second of all, they don't remove that. China has a huge speculation problem and probably a bubble that is about to burst. This is something that doesn't change if you have terms on land ownership. So why have we won this debate? What I would like to tell you is that, first of all, we have shown you that the corruption will always exist in government. It is simply a fact of life, fact of the human condition, and that means that these laws will be used to dislocate poor indigenous from their land and remove from them the security net that is property rights that can protect them from the tyranny of the state and the private individuals. For these reasons, please vote for all.
Thank you. Now we have the top reply in the debate for their side of the House. Here.
Just a second, please. The vagueness of proposition's model actually leaves holes for the government to exploit, and through this exploitation, poor suffer. And that's the exact case of team opposition, and that's the exact problem we presented in this debate, and that's the exact reason we win this debate. So what's going to happen through this speech? I'll go over through the debate and talking firstly about the efficiency of their model, how it's harming the poor, and then I'll be presenting our case and why it's actually winning us the debate. So let's start with the efficiency of the model. They present you a very basic idea of, firstly, the government's going to give housing to the poor. They're going to put in for hospitals as well and general infrastructure. And thirdly, they tell you something is going to the free market. And they tell you the government will be the one responsible for doing this and choosing which part is going to be sold. And that's the exact problem of this model. The government has too much power and too much control to decide what goes where there and what comes with. If they want to really protect the rich, and if the rich have pretty much paid them off, they can just simply put all the houses on the free market. The rich are the only ones that actually have pretty much enough money to buy these houses, and that's exactly why they don't really get any change on their side. We tell you this is generally just a strategic mistake, but regardless of that, we tell you that the efficiency of their model is not as good at solving the core of the problem. We tell you inequality is rooted deeply in our society because in the status quo, not because of land, but because of shares with companies, as we've given you the example of Mark Zuckerberg, where pretty much just because someone, if you take a land away from the rich and give it to the poor, it doesn't mean they're going to give to get a good life right now. We tell you they need rent, they need education, and they need a lot of other things to actually benefit from, and meaning they're simply not that efficient. Furthermore, we tell you they actually harm the poor on their side because the independency they're losing. We tell you that private property is so important because it makes us independent from the state. It gives us a safety net, which where we only rely on ourselves and our resources that we've worked for and gained. And through these resources, we don't really depend on the state doing anything that's corrupt, and we can actually just open our shop. We tell you this is the exact mechanism why the poor are actually getting out of poverty. We tell you because they have a backing through their private property. They give opportunity through generations to get one shop, to get another, but at the moment when we start relocating them, when we start taking land away from them, and when we start to just do all of this, they start being in a worse position. Furthermore, we tell you the rich in the Western governments are usually the ones that are actually lobbying the government, meaning they have a very big share of what goes where and what happens with this land, and believe me, they're not really going to help the poor. And if we're talking about corrupt governments from the very examples they're giving you, like Brazil, the problem is only worse. So we can see that the poor are disproportionately harmed on their side rather than on our side. Furthermore, Gabriela introduces our second substantive, not talking only about the poor, but the middle class as well. That was never adequately refuted by team proposition. We tell you, well, if you're giving all the land to the poor, what's happening with the middle class? What's happening with them? You're literally taking away land from them, and they're not rich enough to simply buy new land, and so on. So that's a point they don't really have a response to. And furthermore, about their third substantive, where they're pretty much telling you, well, land is approximated and that's bad for the market. We've given you an example of China where pretty much the same thing happened with a model similar to theirs, meaning they're not really solely resolving the problem on their side. So because the poor are actually benefited on our side, and because we've shown you a basic principle that upholds democracy, I think it's pretty clear opposition takes this debate.
And now the proper reply.
We've seen an interesting strategy from team opposition. At the start of the debate, we thought their case was going to be about inequality, was going to be about defending property rights, and they were going to stick to their principle. But by the end of the debate, it seems that all they talked about across 12 minutes of turn and reply was how governments were awful and corrupt. Opposition really think that the majority of the world is authoritarian governments propped up by wealthy individuals, and they call it colonialism but prettier. That's just not the case. And we've explained to you across 3 speakers that most democratic governments care for the poor because votes count. That is why they can implement their policy of progressive taxation. They cannot have their cake and eat it too. Because if governments were so corrupt, if governments only cared about the wealthy, then why on earth would they implement progressive taxation on their side? For their policy to work, the government needs to care about the people, it needs to care about the poor. Again, a further additional line of response that we gave to you was that even if governments are bad, companies are far worse. That you cannot put the lives of the poor in the hands of the profit motive, and that no matter how corrupt governments were, it was always going to be companies that were worse. A line that we said in second, again in third, sadly unresponded to. In this reply speech, I'm going to look at a given plot of land. It's an identical plot of land on both sides. And I just want to take you through what happens to this plot of land in the world of the opposition and the world of the proposition. I'm going to show you how it is in our world that we use this plot of land to achieve the aims that both sides agreed on in this debate, to maximize development and to minimize inequality. But first, who owns our plot of land? The opposition will probably say that land is predominantly owned by the poor. But we explained to you that that wasn't the case. That colonialism made sure that the original landowners had to give it up. That companies like Shell in Nigeria and Lotte in Korea bought everything up for a pittance decades ago. They're probably right that poorer individuals are dependent on the land, but not as owners, as laborers and employees. And even in the rare cases that they do own the land, often they can't prove it or use it because they might not have the title deeds. In the case of indigenous groups, they don't even have capital to do anything with the land in the case of poorer individuals. Again, always from the top in first speaker, not much response from their side. So everything they illustrated in first and second about how important land is, none of it is accessed by the poor. The more realistic depiction is this. That plot of land is owned by a man whose family lives far, far away and who has no interest in developing that land. He didn't earn that land or buy it. He inherited it from his grandfather, who stole it when he enslaved the previous owners during apartheid. The world of the opposition would pray and pray that he would somehow sell them the land. But it's easy for him to just say no, and opposition will go, right, property rights, I can't do anything about that. It was the world of the opposition that looked something like Hong Kong, where entire families squeeze into what can only be described as a cage by the side of the road because they cannot afford their home. All they can do in the world of the opposition is look at the golf courses being built where there could have been public housing. All they can do is look at the apartment blocks that are completely empty because the owner prefers to speculate the markets rather than put it up for sale. Team opposition would tell them, it's okay, because when you become a billionaire, we'll respect your property rights too. It's fair for everyone. You heard that third speaker. It will eventually happen for you. Don't worry. The only problem is, when we peeked behind the curtain of their lovely outcomes, we found no mechanism as how this was ever going to happen for the poor. The world of the opposition is the world of the 2008 financial crisis, caused by the subprime mortgage crash, destroying livelihoods and applying global economies. Because their only response to the entire argument of speculation was, the outcomes haven't been proven. I'm sorry, they have, and that seems like an outcome they were willing to live with. Finally, it was in the world of the opposition that they said that everyone would have a safety net, but disregarded who really owns land. I can't really think of an analogy other than the fact that they offered free parking to anyone who owns a yacht and say that's fair for every single person. It was the world of the opposition where they hid behind property rights and claimed that they helped the poor. It was in the world of the proposition that we used our plot of land to build public services. That we explained to you that governments have the incentive to care for people rather than profit-motivated companies. It was the world of the proposition that respected the poor, that disregarded inequality, and that redistributed land. We are very proud to stand on proposition.